The courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that made every breath feel heavier. Rows of spectators, journalists, city officials, and off-duty officers filled the gallery, their eyes locked on the two men at the defense table. Officers Michael Reed and Jason Carter sat frozen, their hands clasped together, their faces drained of color. They had walked into this courtroom expecting a slap on the wrist, a quiet resolution behind closed doors, maybe even a suspension they could ride out. Instead, they were staring down the cold, unwavering gaze of Judge Thomas Wilkins, a man known for his intolerance toward corruption in law enforcement. The judge cleared his throat, his voice firm, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Given the overwhelming evidence of racial profiling, excessive force, and misconduct, disciplinary action is inevitable. This department will not tolerate abuses of power. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A few officers in the back shifted uncomfortably. Others sat stone-faced, calculating what this ruling meant for them. And then the final blow came. Across from the officers, a man adjusted his tie with calculated precision. He was calm, his expression unreadable, but there was a weight behind his eyes, a weight of experience, of restraint, of knowing exactly how this would play out. Daniel Dan Harris leaned forward, his voice steady but sharp. "I am Chief Daniel Harris, the man you unlawfully arrested, and I am here to make sure this never happens again." Reed and Carter's jaws dropped. Their entire world tilted. The man they had treated like a nameless nobody, the man they had profiled, humiliated, and thrown into a jail cell, was not just another citizen. He was their boss. Murmurs exploded through the courtroom like a wildfire. Journalists scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and somewhere in the back a city official muttered, "Jesus Christ." Reed clenched his fists under the table. This couldn't be happening. How had they let this happen? How had they not known? But a more pressing question loomed. What happens now? The judge's gavel banged once, demanding silence. Before we proceed any further, I want to remind everyone in this courtroom, justice is not a privilege, it is a right, and it will be served. Carter stole a glance at Reed, his throat tightening. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in their careers, they weren't the ones in control. Somewhere in the back, a journalist whispered to her colleague, "This is going to change everything." The evening was quiet, the streets nearly empty, as Chief Daniel Harris drove through the suburban neighborhood. The weight of the day's meetings pressed heavily on him. Conversations about police reform, community trust, and departmental accountability. He had been in this job for only 3 weeks, and already the resistance within his own department was palpable. Change wasn't welcome here. His fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel as he exhaled. His wife had texted earlier, reminding him that dinner was waiting. He smiled at the thought, the idea of a quiet evening at home, a rare comfort. Then, red and blue lights flooded his rear-view mirror. A sinking feeling settled in his gut. He checked his speedometer, 29 meets, well under the limit. No broken taillights, no traffic violations, no reason to be stopped. Still, the sirens wailed behind him, insistent, demanding compliance. He knew exactly what was happening. Danielle signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, his heartbeat steady but his mind racing. He had spent decades teaching young black men how to survive encounters like this. Keep your hands visible, move slow, stay calm. Now he was about to follow his own advice. The crunch of boots against gravel filled the air. 2 officers approached, Michael Reed on the driver's side, Jason Carter on the passenger's. Their posture was already aggressive, hands hovering near their weapons. "License and registration," Reed ordered. His tone wasn't a request. It was a command. Daniel nodded, his movements deliberate. "I'm reaching for my registration now. My license is in my wallet." No acknowledgement. Reed's flashlight was already in his face, scrutinizing him. Carter's eyes scanned the inside of the car, searching for a reason, any reason, to escalate. Daniel handed over his documents. Reed barely glanced at them before scoffing. Harris, huh? We get a lot of Harrises around here. The implication was clear. Another black man. Another problem. Daniel forced himself to remain composed. May I ask why I was stopped, officer? Reed smirked. You were swerving, reckless driving. A blatant lie. They both knew it. Daniel kept his voice even. I have a dash cam. It will show I was driving within my lane the entire time. Reed's smirk didn't fade. Instead, he leaned in, voice dropping just enough to make it clear. Oh yeah? Let's see how useful that footage is when your car disappears. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but he didn't react. He knew men like Reed, officers, who believed power was their right, not a responsibility. Carter moved closer, scanning Daniel's clothing, his watch, the way he carried himself. What are you doing in a neighborhood like this? Daniel met his gaze. Going home. Reed and Carter exchanged a glance. A silent decision was made. Step out of the vehicle. Daniel hesitated. Is there a reason for this, officer? I've complied with everything you've asked. Step out of the vehicle. Now. This was escalating exactly the way he had seen it happen before. Daniel inhaled slowly, unbuckled his seatbelt, and pushed open the door. The moment he stepped out, Carter grabbed his arm roughly, yanking him toward the hood of his SUV. Spread your legs. A hard pat-down followed, more forceful than necessary, more about control than safety. What exactly are you looking for? Daniel asked, his voice calm but firm. Reed's smirk widened. Anything that explains why you're acting so damn nervous. Daniel nearly laughed. Nervous? No. Calculating? Absolutely. Carter pulled out Daniel's wallet, flipping through it. He examined the ID, frowning. This doesn't look real. Daniel's patience was razor thin. It's a government-issued ID, officer. Yeah? Looks a little too polished for someone like you. The final insult. Turn around, hands behind your back. The cold metal of the handcuff snapped around Daniel's wrists. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice. As they shoved him toward the squad car, Daniel glanced down the street. A young black man stood on the sidewalk, phone in hand. Recording. Their eyes met. Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The video would speak for itself. The squad car rattled over potholes as it cruised through the dimly lit streets. Chief Daniel Harris sat in the back seat, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, the cold metal biting into his wrists. He didn't speak. He didn't resist. He just waited. Up front, officers Michael Reed and Jason Carter exchanged smug glances. Another one off the streets, Reed muttered under his breath. Carter chuckled. Reckless drivers always have an excuse. Daniel didn't take the bait. He had seen men like them before, drunk on power, convinced of their own invincibility. Instead, he watched the route they were taking. It wasn't direct to the precinct. They were stalling. This was a tactic he had seen before. Keep a suspect in custody longer than necessary, make them sweat, disorient them, let them feel powerless. But Daniel wasn't some average suspect. He was waiting for them to make one more mistake. After what felt like an eternity, the car finally pulled into the precinct parking lot. The doors flung open, and Reed yanked Daniel out with unnecessary force. "Watch your step, Chief," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. They led him through the station's entrance. Other officers barely spared him a glance. Just another black man in cuffs, just another routine booking. The air inside was thick with the scent of old coffee and bureaucracy. The processing area was nearly empty, save for a few officers finishing up paperwork and a man slumped in a corner cell, humming a tune to himself. Reed shoved Daniel toward the front desk, where a tired-looking desk sergeant barely glanced up before flipping open a booking sheet. Charge. Reed smirked. Reckless driving, resisting arrest, obstruction of justice. Daniel's jaw clenched. Resisting? He had complied with everything. But this was the game. They weren't just arresting him. They were building a case against him. Carter leaned in, whispering something to Reed, who nodded. He grabbed Daniel's wallet again, flipping through it slowly. Then he made his final mistake. "This ID," Reed said, holding it up, "doesn't look right." Daniel exhaled sharply. "It's real." Reed's smirk widened. "You're awfully confident for someone sitting in cuffs. You people always think you're untouchable." Daniel met his gaze, silent. "You people." He had heard it before, too many times. Carter stepped toward the fingerprint scanner. "Let's run his prints, see what pops up." The moment the scanner finished processing, the screen flashed his full record. Daniel Harris, Chief of Police, appointed 3 weeks ago. The room fell silent. Reed paled. Carter blinked rapidly. They had just arrested their own boss. Daniel didn't move. He let the silence do the talking. The silence in the precinct was suffocating. Officers Michael Reed and Jason Carter stood motionless, their faces drained of color as they stared at the screen, confirming their worst nightmare. Daniel Harris, Chief of Police. Reed's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Carter shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twitching at his side. They had screwed up. Badly. Lieutenant Vanessa Ortiz entered the room, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. She had heard the whispers. A black man arrested under questionable circumstances. But now, as she looked at the screen displaying Harris's credentials, she felt a cold rage bubbling inside her. "Are you telling me," she began, her voice razor-sharp, "that you arrested our police chief because you thought his ID was fake?" Reed finally found his voice, but it was weak. It was a misunderstanding, Lieutenant." Ortiz's jaw tightened. "A misunderstanding?" She turned to Carter. "Did you even attempt to verify his identity before throwing him in a cell?" Carter hesitated. They both knew the answer. Ortiz exhaled sharply, snatching the keys from the booking desk. Without another word, she marched toward the holding cells. Daniel sat on the cold bench inside the dimly lit cell, his expression unreadable. He had seen this game play out too many times before, except this time he wasn't a bystander. He was the proof. The lock clicked and the door swung open. Ortiz stood there, her face impassive. "Chief Harris, you're free to go." Daniel rose slowly, rolling his shoulders as the tension left his muscles. As he stepped out, he met Reed and Carter's eyes. Their expressions had shifted from arrogance to thinly veiled panic. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Instead of heading home, Daniel walked straight past them, out the precinct doors and into his car. He had work to do. The unraveling begins. At the time the morning news cycle began, Daniel was sitting in the office of Channel 5 News. Across from him, anchor Rebecca Lane studied him carefully. "Chief Harris," she began, "this footage is shocking. Are you saying you were racially profiled by your own officers?" Daniel folded his hands, his voice steady. "I'm saying I was stopped without cause, arrested without evidence, and thrown in a cell without due process." The station aired the dashcam footage, showing every second of the stop, his legal driving, the baseless accusations, the threats. The city exploded. Social media was ablaze. News outlets ran the footage on repeat. Protesters gathered outside the precinct demanding accountability. Inside the police department, Reed and Carter's careers were hanging by a thread. And Daniel? He was just getting started. The city was on fire, not in flames, but in outrage. Overnight, the footage of Chief Daniel Harris's wrongful arrest had gone viral. News anchors dissected every second of the video, and social media was in an uproar. Outside the 28th precinct, crowds had gathered, protesters holding signs demanding justice. Inside the precinct, however, it was a different kind of chaos. Daniel stood at the front of the department's largest briefing room, his presence commanding, his silence louder than the murmurs surrounding him. Every officer in the room had seen the footage. Some sat stiffly, others whispered among themselves, but all of them were waiting for what came next. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. 3 weeks ago, I took this job to bring accountability to this department. He let that hang in the air, scanning the room. Last night, 2 of my own officers arrested me, not because I broke the law, not because I resisted, but because they saw a black man behind the wheel and decided that was enough. The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy storm cloud. This department has a choice, he continued. We can either defend a broken system, or we can fix it. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few officers exchanged uneasy glances. Others sat stone-faced, unwilling to react. Daniel took a step forward. Officers Michael Reed and Jason Carter have been suspended, pending a full investigation. Some officers tensed. Others nodded slightly. The division was clear. But this is not just about 2 men. This is about a culture, a pattern of behavior that has gone unchecked for too long. Starting today, there will be changes. He could feel the tension rise. Resistance was expected. Change was never easy. Bias training is no longer optional. Every traffic stop, every arrest will be reviewed. If you cannot uphold the values of this badge, you do not belong here. Silence. A few officers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked at him with respect, others with resentment. Daniel let the moment linger before delivering the final blow. If any of you think what happened to me was just an isolated incident, think again. The only difference between me and countless others is that I had a title they couldn't ignore. His words cut deep. Without another word, he turned and walked out. The message was clear. This department would change, or it would crumble. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, police officers, both in uniform and in plain clothes, filled every seat. The tension was palpable, thick, like a storm waiting to break. At the defense table, officers Michael Reed and Jason Carter sat stiffly, their faces expressionless, but their eyes betraying the weight of the moment. Their department-appointed attorney whispered something to them, flipping through a thick file of legal documents. Across from them, Chief Daniel Harris sat with his attorney, Sandra Liu, a powerhouse in civil rights law. Her fingers tapped lightly against the case file in front of her, calm, composed, but razor-sharp. The judge, Honorable Thomas Wilkins, entered and took his seat, his gaze sweeping the courtroom before clearing his throat. We are here today to review the charges of misconduct, wrongful arrest, and racial profiling brought against officers Reed and Carter. He nodded toward the prosecution. The young district attorney stood, walking toward the jury with confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is not a simple mistake. It is a clear and deliberate abuse of power, captured on video, where 2 officers profiled, detained, and falsely arrested an innocent man. Not just any man, but their own police chief. A murmur rippled through the gallery, but the judge quickly silenced it with a sharp look. Then came the moment that would seal the case. Sandra Liu stood, motioning toward the screen. Your Honor, let's allow the evidence to speak for itself. The courtroom lights dimmed, and the dashcam footage played. It showed everything. Daniel's calm compliance, Reed's mocking smirk, Carter's aggressive search of the vehicle, the fabricated charges, and most damning of all, the casual, racist remarks caught on their own body cams. Another one of them causing trouble. Figured. The gasps in the courtroom were unavoidable. A woman in the back shook her head in disgust. Even some officers in the audience shifted uncomfortably. When the lights came back on, Reed's face was pale. Carter was visibly sweating. The defense attorney hesitated before standing. He adjusted his tie, trying to regain composure. Your Honor, my clients acted within their training and made a judgment call. Sandra Liu cut him off instantly. Based on what? His skin color? Silence. The judge turned to Reed and Carter, his expression unreadable. Then he picked up his gavel. Given the overwhelming evidence of racial profiling and abuse of power, I find officers Michael Reed and Jason Carter guilty of misconduct and wrongful arrest. The final bang of the gavel was deafening. Reed and Carter sank into their chairs, their careers and their unchecked power shattered. Daniel exhaled slowly. Justice, for once, had prevailed. But this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of the fight to dismantle the system that allowed it to happen. The moment Chief Daniel Harris stepped out of the courthouse, a wall of flashing cameras and microphones greeted him. Reporters shouted over one another, trying to get a comment, while protesters outside the courthouse erupted in cheers. Justice had been served. For now. Daniel adjusted his tie, scanning the faces around him. He knew this was bigger than him, bigger than this case. The ruling against officers Michael Reed and Jason Carter was just a small crack in a system built to protect those who abused their power. A journalist pushed forward, microphone raised. Chief Harris, the city is demanding sweeping police reforms. What happens next? Daniel met her gaze, his voice steady. What happens next is accountability, not just for 2 officers, but for the entire department. This is not about one bad stop or one wrongful arrest. This is about a system that allows it to happen over and over again. Another reporter interjected, "Do you think this ruling will actually change things?" Daniel let the question sit for a moment before answering. "The ruling proves that justice is possible, but it's not enough. We have to make sure this never happens again. Not to me, not to anyone." He didn't stay for more questions. The real work wasn't in front of the cameras. A shift in power. By nightfall, Daniel was back at police headquarters, standing in the same briefing room where, just days earlier, he had faced a divided department. But this time, the power dynamic had shifted. Officers sat in tense silence. Some still resented him, but others now understood. If this could happen to their own police chief, no one was truly safe from a corrupt system. Daniel didn't waste words. Reed and Carter were symptoms of a larger disease. That disease is unchecked power, and it ends today. A few officers exchanged glances. Some stiffened, others nodded. Effective immediately, new policies are being implemented. Every stop, every arrest, every use of force will be reviewed. Bias training is mandatory, and if any of you think you can operate outside the law without consequences, you are wrong. The weight of his words hung in the air. If you can't uphold the integrity of this badge, turn it in now. A long silence. Then 2 officers stood and placed their badges on the table. They walked out without a word. Daniel nodded once. The purge had begun. The fight continues. Later that night, Daniel sat in his office, staring at the city skyline. His phone buzzed. Calls from civil rights leaders, the mayor, even the governor. The entire system was watching. He picked up his phone and dialed. "It's time, let's get to work." Because this fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The story of Chief Daniel Harris is not just about one wrongful arrest. It's about a deeply flawed system that allows racial profiling, abuse of power, and lack of accountability to thrive. Had Daniel been an ordinary citizen without the visibility of his title, his story might have ended very differently. His case forces us to ask a critical question. How many others have faced the same injustice without a camera to capture it, without a platform to expose it, without a system willing to correct it? This isn't just about 2 officers. This is about a culture of unchecked power, where those who are meant to protect and serve often operate without fear of consequences. Lessons learned. Power without accountability is a danger to society. Justice cannot rely on a person's status. It must be a right for everyone. Real change doesn't happen through silence. It happens when people demand it. This case proved that the system can work, but only when it's forced to. The question is, how many more wrongful arrests, how many more lives ruined before true reform happens? Now it's up to all of us. What you can do. Raise awareness, share this story, have conversations, and don't look away. Demand change. Support policies that hold law enforcement accountable. Engage. If you've ever faced injustice, speak up. If you believe in justice, stand with those who fight for it. What do you think needs to change to prevent incidents like this? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe in justice, accountability, and the power of truth, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Let's keep this conversation going, because change doesn't happen by accident. It happens when we refuse to stay silent.